So every once in a while, there's this weird thing that happens in basketball media where everyone seems to be dogpiling on one specific player or on one specific legend simultaneously. We've been witnessing that fairly recently, and in this case, Shaquille O'Neal is the target. So there's 3 instances that I want to talk about. The first is the debate on First Take between Stephen A. and Mad Dog. The second is what Bill Simmons said recently on his podcast, where he compared the modern Joel Embiid to Shaquille O'Neal. And third is the thing Shaquille O'Neal has been saying about himself. Yes, believe it or not, I have Shaq as one of the people who needs to stop disrespecting the legacy of Shaquille O'Neal. First off, let's tackle the perspective of Mad Dog on First Take. Take a listen to his thoughts on the diesel.
First off, we got to hear Shaq now do this. Shaq is what, the 5th best center in the history of the NBA? Fifth.
What?
Shaq. What do you mean, what?
Who's the 4 ahead of Shaquille O'Neal? Have
Would
you
like me to
lost
name,
your
you want me
damn
to
mind?
name him for you?
What?
You want me to name him?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Kareem.
Okay.
Yeah. Will.
No.
I'm not giving it to Will.
No, you guys are crazy.
You're not giving it to Will.
No.
You're not going to put Wilt Chamberlain, who averaged 50 points a game and scored 100 a game in 30 minutes.
Who was a foot taller than 99% of the league?
The most dominant player in NBA history. Who was stopping Shaquille O'Neal in any era?
And who's Tim Duncan is better than he is. Tim Duncan's better. And I tell you something, 2 other guys.
That's not a center. Tim Duncan's
Elijah Wan is better. Who beat him 4 straight games.
2-time champion of Shaq's 4. No scoring titles to Shaq's 2. What are you talking about?
And I tell you somebody else who's better. You can laugh all you want.
I love Hakeem, but he won Shaq.
Oh, he's a better player than Shaq. Oh, God, he's better.
First off,
he played Shaq and beat him 4 straight games.
Define me better player.
He's not better than Moses Malone.
What?
There's no chance. Don't give me that
Oh, my Lord, why are you allowed to talk basketball? I love Moses Malone. Elite rebounder.
You think Shaq?
Moses Malone was not Shaq.
Not a chance.
And he was great, but he wasn't Shaq.
Help, Lord.
Malone led the league in rebounding 6 consecutive years.
So what?
He won 2 MVPs.
So now that you've seen this recent episode of grown adults screaming at each other, what are some takeaways? Well, for one, Mad Dog said that Shaq was the 5th greatest center ever, but then he went on to name 5 players ahead of him, which were Kareem, Wilt Chamberlain, Tim Duncan, Hakeem Olajuwon, and Moses Malone. Naturally, this would place Shaq as the 6th greatest center ever, even though he said 5th. Whether or not you consider Tim Duncan primarily as a power forward or a center is certainly debatable, so I won't fault people either way on that one. Now I've got to point out, when Mad Dog said Wilt Chamberlain, Stephen A. Smith responded with one of my biggest pet peeves in basketball, as he stated that Wilt Chamberlain was a foot taller than 99% of the league. This isn't even close to being true, and if you want to hear my breakdown of that, check out my recent video that exposes this myth. Hakeem Olajuwon is an interesting one to have ahead of Shaq, and honestly, I go back and forth on this ranking. Mad Dog states that Hakeem swept Shaq in 4 straight games, and he's correct on that, as the Rockets won the 1995 championship over Shaq's Orlando Magic. But using that as a way of saying Hakeem is better is way too simplistic. For one, although Shaq was incredible, he wasn't yet in his peak form, which he later experienced in Los Angeles. That matchup was between an experienced 32-year-old Hakeem Olajuwon versus a young and developing 23-year-old Shaq. So that's not the most fair comparison when you're looking at their careers as a whole. The other thing that's worth mentioning is that saying that the Rockets swept the Magic is the far more accurate way of stating it, rather than saying that Hakeem swept Shaq. Because if you watched that series, and if you look at their production, you'll see that it was a pretty even battle with a slight edge to Hakeem. Over that series, the Dream averaged about 33, 11, and 5 on 48% shooting from the field, while Shaq put up 28, 12, and 6 on 59%. Beyond that series, Stephen A. mentions that Shaq has 4 rings to Hakeem's 2, which is true, but Hakeem didn't have the luxury of playing alongside of a lethal Kobe Bryant and Dwayne Wade during his prime years. So again, maybe not the most fair comparison. Shaq did have 2 scoring titles, but Hakeem has 2 Defensive Player of the Year awards, which is something that Shaq never achieved. Personally, I think Hakeem is the greatest defensive player since Bill Russell, and it's a large gap between second and third. Honestly, I have no problem with either Shaq or Olajuwon being ranked higher, and I can make an argument either way. But then he took it to another level entirely when he said Moses Malone. Listen, I'm a little frustrated he said this because I personally believe that Moses is usually one of the top 3 most underrated players of all time. But naturally, by pitting him against Shaquille O'Neal, he's inviting people to criticize him instead of appreciate him. Moses was simply one of the greatest rebounders of all time, and as Mad Dog said, he led the NBA in rebounding 6 times in his career, which is a feat that Shaq could only dream of, as he never led the NBA in rebounding. With that being said, Shaq is without question a better rim protector than Moses, and he's a vastly better scorer as well. In Moses Malone's lengthy career, he only had 2 seasons where he averaged at least 26 points per game. On the other hand, Shaq did that every season for 10 years straight. Add on the fact that Shaq has 4 championships to Moses' 1 and 14 All-NBA teams to Moses' 8, and yeah, Shaq is without question higher on the all-time list. People forget that for 3 or 4 straight years of basketball, every team outside of Los Angeles was trying to stop Shaq, and would spend entire off-seasons making moves to adjust to him. He was the league's gravitational pull during his best in the NBA, and nowadays, people are taking that for granted. Now that ESPN clip wasn't the most disrespectful thing to Shaq in this video. It's this next one. Take a listen to these recent comments from Bill Simmons on his podcast.
This Embiid season though, just quickly, holy shit. So he's averaging 35 points a game. I think he's the best offensive center since Kareem in 1972. Kareem in 72, 34.8 points a game, 57% field goal. Embiid is 35 points a game, 55% field goal. Here's the thing. Termini mentioned this last week on the podcast, and this is the most important Embiid point, and this is why he has a case for being the best offensive scoring center that we've seen since Wilt Chamberlain. He makes his free throws. He's at 89.3% for his free throws this year. He's making 10.3 free throws a game out of 11.6 attempts. Shaq in 2000, Shaq averaged 29.7 points a game in his MVP season in 2000. Embiid was 35 points a game. Shaq was 57% from field goals. Embiid's 55. What's the difference? Shaq made 5.5 out of 10.4 free throws a game. Embiid makes almost 5 more free throws a game, which is exactly the difference in their points per game. And on top of it, you can't foul him at the end of games. So I have Shaq, I don't know, he's like 12th or 13th in my pantheon. At least this version of Embiid right now is just a better player than Shaq. He is. Because Shaq was a 44-minute overpowering guy, and in the playoffs against the wrong team, whatever. But those last 4 minutes, that's when Kobe was so important, and you know all that stuff. But Shaq's free throw shooting was an absolute unequivocal liability for them. And Embiid's free throw shooting is a legitimate strength for the Sixers. So, Jesus, 35 points a game and shooting almost 90% from 3, and you're 7'2". Unbelievable.
Alright, now before I pick this apart, I want you to understand, I'm actually a big fan of Bill Simmons. In many ways, I admire this guy, considering how he's simply a basketball superfan who built his brand on the power of his passion. In many ways, I'm trying to follow the path that he set out. This is also my copy of the Book of Basketball, which is a book he wrote and is an awesome read. So with all of these things considered, I'm actually surprised to hear him make such a casual conclusion in this instance. Looking at different eras and seeing a recent guy averaging 35 and one guy averaging 30, and then concluding that the more recent guy is better simply because 35 is higher than 30 is one of the most surface level takes that I've heard. Since the NBA merger in 1976, this is the highest scoring NBA season ever. In today's NBA, teams are averaging 115.5 points per game, and in Shaq's 99-2000 MVP season, teams were averaging only 97.5 points per game. And in all of Shaq's seasons with the Lakers, that was the only year where the league average was above 97 points. For a multitude of reasons, offensive statistics are ridiculously inflated in the modern game. There's triple-doubles galore, there's back-to-back 20-point and 20-assist nights, 40 and 50-point games are a nightly occurrence, and a rookie flirted with a quadruple-double while having a minutes restriction. In the modern season, 14 players are averaging at least 26 points per game, and in Shaq's MVP season, he was one of only 2 players to average at least 26. I'm writing this script on January 1st, 2024, and as of this moment, there have been 462 30-point games in the 2023 to 2024 season. In the totality of the 1999 to 2000 season, there was a total of 502 30-point games. So obviously, the total is close. But it shouldn't be, considering the fact that modern teams are only 32 games into the 82-game regular season. This means that this current year will far exceed the amount of 30-point performances of the entire 99 to 2000 season, well before we've even hit the halfway point. If that doesn't tell you how inflated today's stats are, then nothing will. The numbers being inflated is just one of 3 reasons why these comments are ridiculous by Bill Simmons. The second reason is because it's insanely premature. We are just over 1/3 into an NBA regular season, and we're giving someone the title of the greatest scoring center since Kareem, simply because of what he's done in a very small sample size. 32 games into the 2019 to 2020 NBA season, James Harden was averaging a whopping 38.3 points per game. People were speculating if he would average 40 that year, and at that point, some were even referring to him as the greatest scorer since Michael Jordan. But then, he dropped off significantly, and averaged just 30.8 points for the rest of the year, dropping his seasonal average to 34.3. Now in hindsight, those comments about Harden look ridiculous, and people can now see how these analysts were slaves of the moment. Listen, I don't care if it's 1964, 1994, or 2024. Averaging 35 points per game on tremendous efficiency is incredibly impressive and worth appreciating. And from that perspective, Joel Embiid certainly deserves his due credit. But if you're gonna give him the title of the greatest offensive center since Kareem, then you can't just ignore the context of the era, like the faster pace of play, like the existence of the defensive 3-second rule which opens up the painted area, and the less frequent calls for traveling. The third reason why Bill's comments are absurd is because, good God, the playoffs actually matter. How are you going to give someone the title of the greatest offensive player when that same player isn't even great when the games actually matter? In the entire 2023 playoffs, Embiid averaged just 23.7 points on 43.1% shooting and 17.9% from 3-point range. In the entire 2022 playoffs, Embiid averaged 23.6 points on 48.4% shooting and 21.2% from 3-point range. He's in his late 20s, and these are the prime years of his career, yet he has a tendency of coming up incredibly small offensively in the playoffs. Meanwhile, these were the averages that Shaq was putting up for 3 years in the NBA Finals at this same age, and at a time that producing offense was much more difficult. Plain and simple, this shouldn't even be a conversation. What Embiid is doing roughly a third into the regular season is impressive, but he hasn't yet earned his way into the conversation with Shaq of the greatest scoring center since Kareem. So at this point of the video, we've seen ESPN analysts disrespect Shaq, we've seen a podcaster disrespect Shaq, and now we're going to take a look at Shaq disrespecting Shaq. When it comes to personalities, the Diesel is one of the most fascinating ones that I've ever followed. He almost seems bipolar at points. Sometimes he's the most egotistical person in the room. As he'll flaunt his 4 rings, he'll declare himself as the most dominant player ever, and he'll speak of himself in third person. But then at other times, you won't find a more humble athlete. Shaq recently said that Steph Curry is better than him. Years ago, he said that Giannis was better than him at the same age. He said that Bill Russell, Wilt Chamberlain, and Hakeem Olajuwon were all better. Recently, he said that at no point was he ever better than Kobe Bryant and Dwayne Wade, which is crazy when you consider how he was once teammates with a fresh out of high school Kobe Bryant, who was averaging just 7 points, while Shaq was averaging 26 and 12. In 2001, he said that Kobe was the best player in the world, despite the fact that Shaq was the defending MVP and Finals MVP. In 1997, he tried to decline his spot among the 50 greatest players of all time, so a more veteran player could take his spot. I'm a big believer in letting others praise you and not doing it yourself. But at the same time, Shaq's humility and dismissiveness of himself has gone so far that I think it's starting to affect how he's remembered. This was a guy who was 1 vote away from a unanimous MVP. This is a guy who averaged 35 and 15 over 3 straight NBA Finals, which is a championship accomplishment that can only be rivaled by the great Michael Jordan. Shaq was a guy who shaped the Western Conference in the early 2000s, and sure, he wasn't a great foul shooter, but I've never seen a player put more bodies in foul trouble than Shaq did at his peak. Shannon Sharpe and many other talking heads have regurgitated the narrative that Shaq didn't have great longevity due to his lack of fitness. And although that's true to a small extent, it's definitely massively overblown. For goodness sake, Shaq finished as a top 4 finalist in the MVP voting, a whopping 12 seasons apart, which very few legends can even claim. If it wasn't for Wilt Chamberlain, he would be universally recognized as the most dominant player in NBA history. And without question, he's one of the top 3 greatest finals performers of all time, which is, after all, where legacies are built. So at this point, I don't care if Shaq keeps disrespecting himself. If you want to authentically claim that you know basketball, then you'll stop disrespecting Shaquille O'Neal. Thanks for watching as always, make sure to like and subscribe for more basketball content, and I'll see you guys in the next video.